Hi all. So I thought we'd try and tackle the whole misconceptions that are behind creative writing and start thinking about how we can write a lot about a little. That is to say that we remind ourselves that we're not being asked to write an entire novel. We're actually asked to write more of a narrative moment, a smaller narrative and descriptive moment, a well-written piece. So where might we start? We have to think about that whole idea of writing a lot about a little. So when we're describing a character, setting, or a particular action, we can really draw out that description. For example, the way in which the character moves, tiny habits that they have, the way in which they open their eyes or interact with their surroundings, all suggests particular emotions and particular personalities of the character without explicitly telling our readers to do that. So I think we have to sort of break that down into some key points. First, we need to remember that we describe all the finer details, and it's these details that give us the emotions and the personalities of our characters. We also need to think about our characters inside out. We need to know every little tiny detail about those characters. Obviously thinking about the way in which we're communicating that, and mainly just making sure that we're being realistic and bringing our characters to life. So say, for example, this is our character. So what do we see? Okay, so when I look at this person, I think about all the tiny little details. Things like his hair is really wispy, we've got dark, bushy eyebrows, he's got dark bags under the eyes, he's got really dark eyelashes, he's got quite a protruding Adam's apple, he's got a brown t-shirt on. All these tiny little details could become something if built upon. So I think about the tiny details of my character, and then that leads on to questions that I might ask about my character. For example, I notice he has bags under his eyes. Is he not getting sleep? Why might he not be getting sleep? What is he doing during the daytime? I can see that he's wearing a brown t-shirt. What does that suggest about his surroundings? Has he just come from work? Like all of these tiny questions that you might ask yourself, which then leads on to tiny little moments or perhaps descriptive sentences with all of those encapsulated within it. So I've taken a finer detail, I've thought about what that means about my character, and I try and form some kind of descriptive sentence based around that. How could you perhaps pop that onto paper? It's really important to have a book that's full of all these descriptive pieces and descriptive ideas, because you can then work from that. Why not take one of these characters and use it in lessons? Why not take one of these characters and use it in your actual exam? There's nothing stopping you. There's also nothing stopping you from taking really great phrases and descriptions from other literary writers. Here are some of my favourite ones. So for example, in 1984, Orwell describes one of his characters as having thick, dark hair, a freckled face, and swift, athletic movements. He's not being too flowery with the language. He's not chucking in hundreds of adjectives. He's being quite subtle, but quite realistic. Thick, dark hair, a freckled face. Similarly, in June, we've got this soft, round face. She appeared completely unafraid. Instead of saying she was scared, she had this in her face, her eyes were... It's just subtle, but it's quite real. A soft, round face. In Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which is quite a good and interesting novel, we've got a sharply defined small face and an expression of sullen distaste. It's lovely. It's a lovely way of showing me bits of that personality there. I also like the expression in the last one, the face like the moon, pale and somehow wavering. Just tiny little moments that you could borrow or take from other writers and pop in your own work and adapt it for your own pieces of writing and for any character that you want to develop. So let's say that we've done all of those steps, we've thought about the finer details. This could be an exemplary response. Think about how I've subtly and realistically developed my character. A slight turn of his head gave me a momentary glance at his face, which, like the moon, was pale and somehow wavering. I could get the gist of his features. His long hair wafted around him like black smoke, its tendrils curling and moving of their own volition. His eyes darted to the left, and for a brief second seemed to catch mine. They looked worried. His dark eyebrows framed the anxiety of his stare and seemed to look straight through me. He had, on his sharply defined small face, an expression of sullen distaste. In my confusion and embarrassment, I looked away. Think about where we're getting these characters from. You need to use people that are around you, people that you're interacting with. I often like to use people that I see on the tube, that I see walking down the street. I like to look at their movements. I like to look at their facial expressions. And perhaps I note down some of these in my books and my journals to keep a record of it. And they can become my characters. Dickens used to walk down the street, and all of his characters are based on people that he's seen or people that he's interacted with or people that he knew in his lifetime. You can take moments of characters and you can change it and adapt it and make that character or that real person older or younger or completely different, wearing the same clothes but perhaps a different person. You can really pick anything you like from these characters, but definitely use people around you for inspiration. So we think about expanding and making a lot out of a little with our characters and our descriptions. Can we actually do that for the content itself? So for the actual exam task, you're not going to be asked to write lots and lots and lots. You're going to be asked to write about a simple and subtle task. So I think there's something in making a lot out of quite simple and mundane tasks. So let's take a few of these, for example. Can you think about descriptive pieces based on just these simple tasks? How can you make a lot out of a little in the actual moment itself? It's important to slow everything down. Not a lot needs to happen. You don't have to have outrageous stories here. They can be quite subtle, quite realistic, tiny moments of movement. I always use this example. So the other day I did actually read through some of my students' work, and they were supposed to be writing about a bus journey. And in that story, they had a man who got on a bus. That was their first paragraph. But then all of a sudden, there was a natural disaster. There was an earthquake that shook the bus, and the bus crashed. And as a result of this, the bus driver died. That was the second paragraph. And then the lady who was pregnant that sat behind the bus driver gave birth. But luckily, somebody in front of her helped her and managed to save the baby's life. But quite sadly, the man at the start was then really late to his meeting. And this is the sort of thing that happens to my head when I read stories like that. It's just too overly worded, there's too much, and the student's just gone off on a rant. So let's slow it down. Let's take the bus journey. Actually put yourself on the bus. Actually put yourself in that journey. Who are you standing next to? What are you seeing? What are you feeling? What tiny moments can you take note of? Even just moving and stepping onto the bus itself could be an entire paragraph. Nothing actually really needs to happen other than you perhaps noticing something or remembering something. So what actually might this look like, or should this look like, as a piece of description? The 249 came to a halt metres away from the stopping point. I sighed, heaved my bag over my shoulder and walked over to the door. It lurched open. The unwelcome waft of damp, hot air hit me first, a reminder of my long day at work. The driver looked in my general direction and muttered something almost inaudible about a ticket. Like clockwork, I handed over my bus pass, glancing over my shoulder at the crowds of people standing, shoving, texting. I thanked the man, then cautiously weaved my way through the bodies and the bags until I found a suffocating space between two armpits. So for this, I actually used my own experience of being on the bus. Look how I've made a lot out of a little. I've actually just stepped onto the bus here, but I really think about my surroundings and how I develop my character. Let's try another one. So I really got the heaviness and the slog of being on the bus. Now I'm going to try and translate that into perhaps something as mundane as my morning routine. So this image that I'm about to create for you is something quite similar to my training year as a teacher. But again, I've tried to really show that slog and the weight of trying to plan a lesson in the morning. So here we go, my morning routine. My eyes stared blankly at the cursor on the computer screen. I watched it flash its steady rhythm, as if counting down the seconds I had wasted glaring at it all morning. Come on, think. My breath smelt of the usual stale coffee, and I needed to go to the toilet again, but I knew that I could not pull myself away from this lesson plan. As I thought about those minutes ticking away, I clenched my fists in irritation and cracked the bones of my fingers. It felt good, really good. And for a second seemed to encourage me to stretch my arms out wide and click the bones at my elbows, then my neck, and before I knew it, I was standing in full stretch, curving my spine and letting out a much-needed yawn. The relief lasted a few glorious minutes. Then I sat down again, and the cursor was still flashing back at me. 20 minutes left. I felt a thick lump in the back of my throat. My mouth was dry. Before I knew it, they would be here, stumbling into the door, screaming, shouting, drooling over the tables and falling onto chairs. And I had nothing, a deep, penetrable nothing. And then I thought, that's it. I frantically sifted through my endless pile of papers that had been there for what felt like years until I finally found it. Romeo and Juliet, 1997, Leonardo DiCaprio, 3 hours long. Perfect. So what are we going to take away from today's session? Well, let's remember that we write a lot about a little. Slow it all down, really draw out those descriptions of characters and even the narrative itself. Be very aware of the finer details. This subtlety of characterization builds a personality and creates a more realistic image of your character. Make sure that your character and the setting are interlinked, are woven in between each other. Your character responds to the setting, and similarly, your setting might reflect your character. Make sure our readers can relate, and also ourselves, because the more we relate, the more realistic our character becomes. And I guess, most importantly, slow it down. We don't want that nasty bus journey that we had earlier. We want it to be realistic, subtle, but also quite clever. I hope you enjoyed that session and took something from it. Good luck in your creative writing from now on.